Welcome to The Politics People. We're joined today by a writer, journalist, columnist, author, former Conservative Party politician. He was a member of the European Parliament. He was one of the architects of Vote Leave, which successfully campaigned for the UK's exit from the European Union, and he's the biggest name to come out of Lima, Peru since Paddington Bear. I'm talking today to Daniel Hannan. Thank you so much for doing this.
It is a real pleasure to be here with you, Paul.
So are you conscious of the impact that you've had on politics?
Gosh, that's a hell of a question to start off with. Let me answer it in a slightly elliptical way. It was not long ago that I spoke at the memorial service for my first boss in politics. It was a man called Michael Spicer, who was a Conservative MP, and a very radical Conservative MP. But you wouldn't have guessed it from the facts of his CV. He was chairman of the 1922 committee. He was a minister under Margaret Thatcher. He ended up as a peer in public school, Cambridge. But the secret of him was that he was a radical in establishment clothing. And he was my first boss. And he drummed into me the idea that you can achieve almost anything in politics, provided that you don't care who gets the credit. And he didn't just incarnate that, he took it further as a principle than anyone else I've ever known. When I was working for him, a bid would come in from Newsnight or the Today programme or whatever, and he would say, now who can we give this to? Let's give it to so-and-so, because once he has gone on air and had to say X and Y, he will think that that's his position rather than mine, and he will then be bought into it, and it'll be his thing, and we won't need to worry about him. And I watched him do this over and over again, and it taught me a great deal about how politics would work. And in fact, I remember when I was setting up Vote Leave, I set it up in the sense that I appointed the chief executive and so on. And I remember Michael, who by then was, in his latter years, he had Parkinson's, he wasn't terribly well. And he said to me, but you told me you were on top of the Leave campaign. I said, I am, Michael. Yeah, don't worry. I've got the money coming in. We've got the chief executive. We've decided where the offices are going. And he said, but I've spoken to such and such, and also to, Sir Tufton Bufton, and they tell me that they're running it. And I said, yeah, Michael, I learned that from you. Right? Great. If they think they're running it, brilliant.
Wow. Because so is that one of the prevailing problems with politics, is that actually normally it is just me ego business, and then individuals can actually be scuppered because they're concentrating too much on self-promotion?
I think there is more of that in politics than in the population at large. I think it was P.J. O'Rourke who said disproportionate number of politicians were bullied at school.
Right.
And driven by this kind of need to show everybody, right? Now, that is not true of all politicians. It may not even be true of most politicians. But I think after 21 years in the business, I think I can say with some confidence that it was more true of politicians than of the general population. Not necessarily that they were bullied at school, but that they had, they'd been rejected by their mothers, or something was driving them into wanting to be a big person. And the relatively small number of people who had an agenda, who were not interested in preferment and promotion, but who wanted to get something done, were therefore at a huge advantage because they were so few and so focused. And I think a lot of people fail to make that distinction, if I can put it that way now as an ex-politician.
Yeah.
All politicians are the same. They're all driven by ego. They're all desperate to be on TV and so on. You can tell very quickly which category somebody is in, and you calibrate your behavior accordingly.
So you describe yourself now as an ex-politician. Is that it? Is that a permanent condition now? You're an ex and never to return politician?
I got into politics for one reason, which was what we then didn't yet know to call Brexit. It is very, very rare in my former line of work that you get to quit on your own terms. It's the usual way that a political career ends is either that you lose your seat, or that your party is out of office and you've got nothing to look forward to, or you've been a minister and you're never going to come back, or it sort of peters out. The ability to say, great, that's what I came for, thank you, job done, good luck to the next guy, is so rare. It's a really precious gift. And when that's offered to you, it seems to me you should grab it with both hands and move on.
I'd not actually made that connection, because the cliche is that all political careers end in failure.
Yeah, I'm not sure that that's completely true. And that was Enoch Powell's little dictum. And it, like a lot of the things he said, it sounded great, but wasn't completely true. But it is certainly the case that most political careers peter out one way or another, even if they don't end in failure. I was slightly encouraged in, my decision was made much easier because one of the people I'd worked very, very closely with setting up Vote Leave and indeed in the wilderness years before that, when there were very, very few of us who were angling towards Brexit, was Douglas Carswell, who had been a Conservative MP, defected to UKIP, resigned his seat, fought a by-election that nobody expected him to fight, but he, I thought, very honourably said, look, I don't want anyone in Clacton to say that they only voted for me because of the colour of my rosette. Won his seat, went into the referendum, was successful in the referendum, and then quit. And I've never seen him so happy and fulfilled and content as after he stood down. And it was partly because he had more time at home and better money and so on, but it was mainly because he had got to quit on his own terms. And when I saw that, I thought, once Brexit has come into effect, that's it. You take the win and go and do something else.
And see, I didn't know that was at the core until the core of your side of the divide, if you like, the Brexit side, until Douglas Carswell has been on this show earlier in the run, and that again, I don't want to be too one-sided, but it is pure honor. It's almost like some sort of Japanese samurai code. It's like for the cause and no ego. The establishment had no idea that that's the sort of the purity that they were competing against. Surely.
Yeah, I think it may be one of the things that took them by surprise. I remember I spent a lot of the time in the immediate run-up to the referendum lobbying potential leavers who were in government, ministers. And somebody else, by the way, who will never get anything like the credit she deserves for the vital role she played in all this, was Theresa Villiers, who was the first cabinet minister to come out as a leaver. And by behaving in the way she did, she more or less forced David Cameron to say that you could campaign on either side without having to quit, and that made it a lot easier for others to follow. And I mean, that was, again, very, very typical of Theresa. She was always happy to do things and not be recognized for doing them in a way that very few politicians, and certainly very few male politicians, would recognize. But I remember her saying, the meeting that she agreed to come over, it was the Tate, as all of our meetings were. We used to meet at Tate Britain because we knew that we'd never see any journalists or politicians. We never did. And I remember her saying, we're not going to win, are we? And I said, you can't say that yet, Theresa. You can't say that. We've been doing lots of polls. We've been looking at this. I mean, yes, it's an uphill battle, but it is absolutely worth a shot. And then she said, yeah, I'll tell you what, the one thing you've got going for you is that you've been waiting for this moment for 20 years, and you've been preparing and planning for it for 20 years, and you've thought through all of the scenarios, whereas the other guys are only now distractedly getting around to it while still trying to run their departments and whatnot. She said, if you win, that's going to be why, because you've just been focused on it for longer. And I think that may have been the case, but certainly, I mean, never mind the samurai. In general, I think it is true that nobody voted Leave or publicly backed Leave in the hope of any baubles or recognition. I mean, I remember when we had our victory party a few weeks after the result, it was hosted by, again, a very selfless, very patriotic businessman and financial sponsor of the campaign called John Moynihan. who's blessed with a big house in Chelsea Square and a big garden. And I remember standing at the top of his stairs as I arrived and looking down at his garden that was full of all these leavers, donors, business people, MPs, ministers, editors, and so on. And I looked down and I thought, not a single person is here because they were hoping for a prize, right? Not a single person came out for leave because they thought it would get them a knighthood or a government contract or a job or any kind of recognition. On the contrary, a lot of them forfeited those things because they came out as leavers against the establishment and against the government of the day. Now, a lot of people on the other side, I think, were indeed expecting some kind of rewards. And of course, the funny thing is that despite losing, they got them, right? Yeah. So, there were plenty of gongs and rewards and jobs going around for the people who've been Remainers.
That is extraordinary. I mean, you've queued up my next question. I was going to ask, did you, from day one, think that this was going to succeed, or did you do it just because you had to, just because it was the right thing to do for you?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Paul, because most human beings find it really difficult to think back to before they knew which way something was going to go. Right? It's a really, really well-observed psychological phenomenon that once something has happened, we always kind of assume that it was inevitable, and we tend to think that we saw it coming when we didn't. But I looked back at my diary to satisfy my mind on this. My wife was quite heavily pregnant on the day that the vote came in. Our youngest son, much younger than our other two, was born exactly a month after polling day. And so on polling day itself, I mean, it was quite funny. I said to her, look, I don't know which way the result's going to go. I'll be in London maybe for a day or two. And she looked at me, she said, if you think I am going to effing watch these results coming in on my own after all this, you've got another thing coming. So we fortunately, there was a hotel right next to the Vote Leave HQ, and I installed her there. But I looked back at my diary, and I saw that between Christmas and polling day, on only one occasion had I spent 2 consecutive nights at home.
Good Lord.
So all of the rest of the time, I was out campaigning. Or occasionally in Brussels, but mainly campaigning. And I would not have done that had I thought that either we had it in the bag or that there was no way that we could win. I always thought it was going to be that close that I didn't want to be in self-recrimination for the rest of my life saying, why did you not go and speak at that rally in Newcastle just so that you could, have an evening at home? And that was, so that's why I can say with some confidence, I always thought it was on a knife edge.
Yeah, gosh, that is a very good illustration. It's very Hillary, Wisconsin, that, isn't it? It's like that's got to nag at you forever if you think you didn't do everything that you could. Yeah,
and I wouldn't have minded if we'd lost. I wouldn't. The next morning, I wouldn't have said, "Oh well, but if only this." I mean, but the haunting fear is that you lose by, and it wasn't, as it turned out, a narrow margin. And I suspect, by the way, that partly explains the rage on the other side, because people are never so angry as when they secretly blame themselves for something. So I think that contributed to the fury, which I had really not seen coming from some of my Remain friends.
Well, that brings me on to the next morning you gave what is now a legendary interview to CNN on Parliament. I think it was Parliament Green, wasn't it? It was. I think that's where all the media was set up to CNN. It was Christina Amanpour.
Right.
And anger is the word. Apart the result, the euphoria of the result was one thing. I was sitting here in Los Angeles, and I was lucky enough to be able to vote in that election, or in that referendum. So I'm following all the media. I saw that interview go out live, and anger's the word. Have you ever seen? It's worth looking up on YouTube if you're listening. Daniel Hannan and Christina Amanpour on CNN. 24th of June, I guess, 2016. Were you surprised at the anger that met you that obviously was indicative of exactly the reaction from the opposite
Yeah,
side?
I mean, there was a lot of that. And by the way, that was not the worst interview I had. If we're doing a sort of league table of abusive, aggressive, enraged interviewers who have thrown all objectivity to the wind and are just ranting, way above Christine Amanpour comes Tim Sebastian on Deutsche Welt, who was, I mean, he just, incarnation of not being prepared to accept the result. And there was a lot of this. There was a lot of this going on. People, in every election, the losers are disappointed. I totally get that. And heaven knows I've been there myself often enough. But this was on a different level. This was an absolute refusal to believe in the legitimacy of what had happened. And it manifested itself, first of all, through the most insane conspiracy theories that Leave could not have won fairly. It must have been because of Russian interference, or it must have been because they lied in some sophisticated way, or they stole data or something. And, this is not Twitter loons. This is from Labour MPs, from broadsheet columnists, from serious figures, saying things that are just absolutely batshit crazy because they cannot bring themselves to accept that the majority of the country voted differently. And I've got to say, that really caught me off guard because sure, there were on the Remain side as on the Leave side, there were a handful of eccentrics and extremists, and that that's always true of any cause. And if you have 16 million plus people voting for something, then statistically some of them are going to be oddballs. But the vast bulk of Remainers, I had always thought of as pragmatic, sensible people. Their main argument was actually a perfectly good one, which was not, the EU is wonderful and my European identity is important to me. It was simply, do we need the hassle of the disruption? Are things so bad that we need to tear everything up and risk an uncertain future? And look, that was I think that was a good, powerful, legitimate argument. I totally get why decent, patriotic, sincere people felt that way. What is extraordinary is how that position, which had been dominant during the referendum, I mean, during the campaign itself, it was remarkably friendly, right? I remember I was out manning street stalls, doing public meetings. Very often we would run into the other side with their Stronger in Blue t-shirts, and we'd wish each other luck, and we'd pose for selfies together, and it was all a perfectly civil conversation about sovereignty and trade and money and so on. Afterwards, that went out of the window and it became this culture war. And it became, on both sides, frankly, it became defined by what kind of people don't we like, right? Are we against, and then delete as appropriate depending on which side you were on, are we against the ignorant working class oafs who were led astray by unscrupulous demagogues, or are we against the sneering snobs who secretly hate their own country? And once it's become about the people that you imagine to be on the other side, compromise becomes impossible because it's not about policy anymore. And that really took me off guard, how radicalized the fairly inert, faute de mieux, practical majority of the 48% became in such a short time. Partly, I think, just because they were seeing the same thing over and over again, leading the news for months, for years, as it turned out, after the vote.
God, it's so great talking to you because it's like you were actually there where before we started talking, I was saying about I just want to see how the sausages are made. I mean, this is exactly the kind of the ingredients, if you like, of that event. One of my theories, just running it by you, is that if they'd have triggered Article 50 the day after the vote, I think there was such a tide of anger from the establishment, I think we'd have had a second referendum and been back in by Christmas. The whole thing would have been torn to pieces, but they kind of shot themselves in the foot by dragging the whole thing out as long as possible because the 52% had voted for this thing, were surprised at the anger, and then subsequently over the next 3.5 years could not believe the way the establishment would actually behave towards them, and it almost reinforced the solidity, if you like, of the 52%.
I mean, it was a ghastly time. The 3 years that followed the vote. In fact, really, I think it was only the coronavirus that put an end to it.
Yes.
It was a ghastly time in that, I mean, I always think of British people as pragmatic, reasonable, prepared to disagree in a kind of respectful, jovial way. I've always believed in Thomas Jefferson once said, I never saw a difference in politics, religion, or philosophy as cause to withdraw from a friend. And I always think, well, that kind of should go without saying. But like everyone, I was shocked by how many actual friendships were broken. And it was overwhelmingly one way, I have to say.
Yes.
I don't know of anyone who withdrew from a friendship because they were so angry with someone who had voted Remain. Right? It was, and maybe that was just because of the way the result went. But there was nothing inevitable about that culture war. It could have gone differently in so many ways. To be honest, when the result came in, I thought, okay, this was a narrow result, clear enough to be decisive, but let's not pretend that this is the overwhelming will of the country. It's 52-48. Therefore, let's see if we can find a position that will carry at least the bulk of people on both sides. It may go too far for some and not far enough for others, but that will fairly reflect that result. There must be a way that we can withdraw from the political institutions of the EU while remaining in the bulk of the market institutions. That would represent, it seems to me, a fair compromise. And actually, if you think about it, that's more or less what happened after the Scottish referendum in 2014, right? So 55% of people had voted for the status quo, 45% of people had voted for complete separation. Both sides after that said, okay, we're going to have to find something in between, more devolution, more autonomy, but something that stops short of independence. And that, I think, worked, right? It did its job in Scotland.
Sorry to interrupt, and don't lose the thread of that. But just before, do you remember all the leaders going up to Scotland just before the vote and promising huge amounts of devolution of power? Which we didn't get from, we actually didn't get that because I think they assumed that they'd actually won Brexit. So anyway, sorry, yes, but
exactly right. But by the way, very, very good point. Had the EU, going back to people are never so angry as when they secretly blame themselves, had the EU displayed any flexibility in the run-up to the vote, had they given David Cameron anything in the renegotiation, I think there's no question that he would have won the ensuing referendum.
Agreed.
I felt that the referendum was won in February 2016 when David Cameron came back completely empty-handed, and people saw that the EU would rather lose its second financial contributor than concede any return, any recovery of power to the national level. And I think that just put it beyond doubt for people that this was a ratchet. But going back to what happened, in the immediate aftermath of the vote, there were lots of ways in which we could have had a fairly moderate Brexit that would have stopped short of what, wouldn't have given, in this situation, no one gets 100% of what they want, but that would have carried the bulk of the country, that would have allowed Britain to have a looser relationship where we were not in the EU, but we had fairly close ties with it. And I think the reason that didn't happen is because something utterly freakish that no one had foreseen interfered, and that was Theresa May's premiership. She, of course, had voted Remain. She felt she had something to prove. She therefore had to dig in on some really quite trivial and symbolic issues like the timing and so on, because she knew that she was suspected of not having her heart in it. And to the extent that she got any understanding or any insight at all into why people had voted Leave, she only understood it in terms of migration. So she was prepared to sacrifice absolutely everything else to the goal of border controls. And of course, that was a fundamental misunderstanding of why people had voted Leave. And the proof of that is what happened when she came back with her deal and said, look, I've got the border control back. And everyone said, well, the hell? What about sovereignty? That was the issue for us was democracy, self-government. Yes, border control is a part of that. But I think it would have been, put it another way, if, as was universally expected, a Leaver had led the government, if Boris or Michael Gove or whatever had taken over in 2016 from David Cameron, I think there would have been a much swifter and more moderate kind of Brexit,
Totally.
because Leave would have been in a position to say, guys, we won, but we didn't win big, so we've got to, maybe on migration, yes, we'll have some controls, but we might still maintain the principle that if you've got a job to take up, you can take it up, albeit without all the benefits. There would have been ways of doing it, right? But that avenue was not open to Theresa May, or at least she chose not to take it. And a consequence of that is that the argument was spun out completely needlessly for a further 3 years, with, I think, really deleterious impacts on our political discourse and our whole political culture, because we found ourselves kind of revisiting arguments that really don't belong in a liberal democracy. People saying things like, you shouldn't count a vote if fewer than half of the total eligible electorate voted, or you shouldn't count an election result if I reckon that something that was said on the other side wasn't factually accurate, or whatever. And when enough people are arguing like that for long enough, it begins to undermine the whole basis of an open society.
No, I couldn't agree more. I've always said it's one of the things that's leading us towards, we're talking at the end of August in 2020, and one of the things that's leading us to, I hope, a no-deal Brexit, frankly, is the actions of that Theresa May government, but also Gina Miller, for example. The more this was drawn out, going into that Brexit vote, most Brexiteers would have given their right arm for something like Theresa May's deal coming back from Brussels.
Yeah, but don't underestimate the importance of Brussels saying no to that.
Oh, sure. Right? That's my point.
I mean, definitely Gina Miller played her part in destroying the middle ground. Definitely there was a big chunk of Remainer opinion that was determined to do this scorched earth thing, where they would not settle for any kind of EFTA-type deal because they still thought that they could turn the whole thing around and have another referendum. So yes, they contributed. But let's just remember how this actually played out. Should we get this right? Was it 2018? September 2018, when Theresa May went to Salzburg, she was bringing with her an offer that, had any other country been prepared to make that offer, the EU would have bitten their hands off. If Canada or Japan or any other country had come to the EU and said, look, we will accept all of your standards unilaterally, we will just download them without any input from ourselves, and we will promise never to outcompete you, never to do anything that you disapprove of in the field of environmental regulation or employment law, and we will carry on paying for the privilege, and we will defend you militarily. We'll do all of this and ask nothing in return.
And no subsidies, etc. It was no subsidies to industry, etc.
Exactly. If we'd been prepared, if anyone else had said that, the EU would have said, quick, get the idiots to sign before they come to their senses. And yet when Theresa May made that offer, the EU incredibly still held out for more. Now, I think from their point of view, that turned out to be a huge mistake, because the offer that they're now getting from Boris is, of course, far less attractive from that perspective. But I suspect that even then, they were listening to the John Majors and the Tony Blairs and the Nick Cleggs who were telling them, well, we'll still be able to turn this around, hold tough, and we'll have a second referendum. Which brings us to where we are now. Is there going to be a deal now? And I think
Well, sorry, before we get on to that, no, I just want to see your part in this. And again, I'm just like a fanboy on this whole thing. Please, if this even touches journalism, then I won't have done my job. I'm just literally just asking pub questions. That exactly this point, that the establishment at best thought that we were rabid anti-immigration Little Englanders. And that next morning, that CNN interview, I just remember your face being totally shocked. You were completely indignant at being accused of that this was all about immigration, because you had said for years, just control your own immigration. We might have more immigration. But that memory, and that was definitely on the Leave side, was like, no, we just want to control it. It might actually increase. that aspect of the argument was totally forgotten by Remain
Well, it wasn't just
after the
forgotten.
election, after
Yeah,
the
they never heard.
referendum.
They never heard it because it is a rule of politics, Paul, that nobody or almost nobody actually listens to the other side. Very, very few people go directly to source and read what the other side have said in their own words. What they tend to do, what we tend to do, what people tend to do, is to listen to their friends reporting on what the other side is supposed to have said. Right.
Yeah.
So if you had if your chief source of news during the referendum had been CNN, The Guardian, Sky, you would have assumed that the only possible reason for anyone to vote Leave was kind of xenophobia or hostility to immigration or general nostalgia. But that depends on disregarding a lot of what Leavers said. And I'm not just talking about myself. I mean, yeah, immigration has never been why I wanted to leave the EU. It's not even in my top 10 issues. My issue was democracy, right? But never mind me, because I was hardly the public face of the thing. If you listen to the big set piece events, Michael Gove's interview just before the vote when they did one from each side, Boris at the big rally at Wembley Stadium, the most watched event, the big eve of poll debate, Boris opened his speech by saying, not only am I pro-immigration, I was the only mayor of London who actually tried to get an amnesty for illegal immigrants. This was not something that we were sneaking out in the small print.
Yeah, absolutely.
Nobody could have watched that referendum open-mindedly and come to the conclusion that the only reason to vote Leave was because you were anti-immigration. The top issue all the way through. And the polls showed that this was the top issue for our voters. It was the top issue for the undecideds. It was the top issue for our core people. It was the top issue that we focused on, was sovereignty or democracy or however you want to phrase it, right?
Yeah.
The principle that decisions about Britain should be made in Britain by people who are answerable through the ballot box to the rest of us. Yes, migration is part of that. But even when migration was offered as a separate issue in very neutral language, did you vote Leave because Britain should decide who comes into this country, or did you vote Leave because you wanted sovereignty back? Overwhelmingly, in every poll, people went for sovereignty. And the trouble was, by the end of the campaign, some of the Remain leaders had come to believe their own caricature about the other side, not only in the sense that they thought that we cared only about migration, but also in the sense that they thought we were a bit dim.
Yeah.
And they thought that if they, with a little bit of conjurer's tricks, prestidigitation, if they waved the wand and said, look, borders, you got your borders back, that we would ignore everything else because we really were a bunch of dunderhead working class oafs who couldn't follow the detail. And that's where they made their mistake all the way through the campaign and after it.
I think I couldn't agree more. It's interesting, actually, you say about the working class dunderhead oafs. It's like this was the stealth. This is your career now that I'm looking at, and your kind of stardom in this arena. You were offering, like I said, by stealth for a good couple of decades before the academic, intellectual view of Brexit. It was, if the Remain establishment had wanted to point at anything uncouth and perhaps a bit more unruly, they could point to Farage and just say, he's a golf club president. But you sort of bucked the trend at the time that people like Cameron were coming up and being urbane conservatives. Anyway, you were a bit an urbane conservative, but were espousing something that definitely was not on their agenda. You were using the kind of the Cameron tools and the Blair tools, if you like, of being affable and what's the word I'm looking for? Friendly, smooth, if you like, but using it to espouse. I don't mean anything pejorative in that, but there was suddenly this new crop of politicians from Blair onwards who were much more friendly and much more less austere, less kind of grim. But you were espousing something that was anathema to the new crop of Cameron conservatives.
It was anathema. Yeah, I mean, Farage always used to say to me, I'll speak to the tabloids, you speak to the broadsheets, and I kind of got what, I got where he was coming from. And of course, the tabloids have and had a lot more reach. But I would make one qualification, which is, don't assume that your typical Leave voter in Sunderland or Rotherham was voting Leave for reasons that were radically different from what you called the urbane liberal ones that I was espousing. And the reason I stress this is because I've had this argument a lot since, in quite friendly ways, with friends who voted Remain, right? So they'll say, well, you may have had all these democratic constitutional objections to Brussels, but, yeah, like they were really voting for those reasons in Oldham, or, fill in imagined, blue collar town. To which my answer was, well, only one of us in this conversation spent time in those places during the referendum, right? I was addressing rallies all over the north of England and in Scotland and in Northern Ireland and in lots of constituencies where income is below the national average, where there was high unemployment, all the rest of it. And again, I was struck by how the argument of Leave voters was the same there as among the more kind of libertarian metropolitan Leavers, right? The people were fundamentally concerned about their right to make their own decisions and hire and fire the people who pass their laws. And that's a very, very basic thing that most people have, right? The desire for self-government is a very universal thing. And by the way, the left love it when it's expressed by Venezuelans or Palestinians or even Irish people, right? Totally. But the point is, it's not. You don't have to be a political theorist. And I was very struck all the time by people who were working in call centers or hairdressers or whatever, who would say, look, for me, the basic issue here is democracy. Absolutely. And they meant it. And they thought about it, they read about it, they really listened. And I don't think that the government or the Remain establishment during or after the vote ever understood that. They really did think that the bulk of particularly ex-Labour voters who voted Leave in the Midlands and the North were voting out of gut prejudice and could therefore be easily fobbed off if those prejudices were addressed. And they never really understood that the desire for sovereignty, for self-government, was a deeply thought out and important one for most, for men and women all over the country, as all over the world. And if the EU had grasped that, if they'd been prepared to say, all right, we're going to make some concession on something, you can have, fisheries or just one thing, who can doubt that they'd have won?
Absolutely. No, listen. I come from council estate in South Wales and stuff, and I'm completely of that mind. Literally the only reason that I voted Brexit is because the commission is appointed. That's irritated me since day one. Nothing more than that. I don't care about anything else, but other than the fact there is no mechanism to vote them out. That's all, And I think a lot of people fall into that kind of category, but then they're characterized as being, just rabid racists and, anti-immigration. And that's why they missed their target. That's why, because it is about the Englishman's home as his castle extrapolation. The point I was making is that you could have taken the King's shilling at any time. And I am so waffly, it's ridiculous. But you could have taken the King's shilling and been part of, at any time, you could have just thrown your hand in with the Cameron crew, if you like. And, you'd probably been like Foreign Secretary or even Chancellor within a couple of years with your kind of skills. That's all.
I love my country far too much to have done that to it. But look, I mean, it's certainly true that being a Leaver was a huge block to any kind of career advancement in politics prior to 2016. And even in the most literal sense, that for a long time you couldn't be in receipt of the Conservative whip if you argued that we should leave the EU. In fact,
exactly.
David Cameron changed that. To be fair to the guy, and so the one person who I always you may see this as further evidence of my sort of panty waist namby-pamby metropolitan liberal leavery, but the one person I always rather liked and felt sorry for in all this was David Cameron, because he was actually completely straight. He never pretended to be a leaver. He was always very clear that, that we should stay in the EU, but he had the democratic decency to put the question to the country and to stand by the results. And he's given only a handful of interviews since, but they've all been to say, look, the result must stand, and we're a proper democracy and all this. And I knew him a bit, obviously, and I suspect you're right. I could have probably, if I moderated my views on this, I could have probably I could have risen a bit higher under his premiership. But I was always quite, and still am quite admiring of him. And my guess, the guy gets a really bad press now because people are defined by the last thing that they're remembered for. So leavers are really angry about some of the things that he said during that campaign, because he made the case for staying in aggressively. And Remainers will never forgive him for allowing the referendum in the first place. Actually, I think if you judge the entirety of his premiership, he took over when we had a higher deficit than Greece, and he brought us back from the precipice. I actually think he did a pretty good job. And this, in a way, is the really sad thing. A lot of people who are really quite strong Remainers are friends of mine. Including some who left the party over this. David Gork, who had been. He was one of the people who lost the whip and is now outside politics, but he's someone I've known since we were students. Perfectly sort of reasonable guy. And it's so sad that it wasn't the referendum that caused this, because he accepted the result. It was the continuing culture war afterwards that eventually pushed him into a position of saying, I'm not going to accept Boris and run the risk of no deal, and that ended up with him losing the whip. And you just think, well, what a sad thing that after the event, lifelong Conservatives who are sort of, small government, low tax, centre right on everything else, feel that they've got no place in the party because the post-Brexit culture war became so divisive.
Well, I think that's the recurring theme, even in this discussion, is that the Remain side made no preparation for a possible Leave victory. I think they didn't see it as potentially succeeding, and so they made no. They were dithering for the few days after the result. They had no idea what to say or what to do, and I think that's compounded their problems, if you like.
Yeah, and I think that's true, by the way, on both sides of the channel. So in the immediate aftermath of the vote, the EU drew up a position that I think was plainly designed to cause a second referendum in the UK. Michel Barnier, when he was appointed, told the other leaders, I will have done my job if at the end of this, the terms are so tough that the Brits would rather stay. Right? And everything he's done shows that he meant that. So, you'll remember when the negotiations were happening under Theresa May, the EU basically just said no to everything. And the reason that they were doing that was at least in part because they kept hearing from, Michael Heseltine and, Yvette Cooper and all of the Remain establishment in the UK saying, just hang on in there, give us a bit of time, we can turn this thing around. There's no majority in Parliament. If Parliament says no to everything, there'll have to be a dissolution. We can get a Labour government, we can get a new referendum. Obviously, that strategy failed, right? Boris won his majority. Brexit has gone through. The question now for the EU is whether they can get themselves off that hook. So they assumed a number of kind of almost absurdly unreasonable positions for the sake of trying to get us to vote again. Can they now clamber off them, right? And by the way, to show how absurd they are, just imagine it the other way around, right? Imagine that Britain were to go into these talks saying a precondition of doing a trade deal with the EU is that we have unlimited access to EU fishing grounds, that British judges continue to have a role on the continent, and the EU promises never to outcompete us. Would anyone regard that as a reasonable position? Would anyone blame the EU for saying no to that? And yet, when it's the other way around, some of our commentators and pundits in Britain are so far gone that they will now automatically back any EU position, however unreasonable, however absurd it is. And so the EU is sort of stuck in this, in an impossible negotiating position, which I think means that we're probably 50-50 as to whether we get a deal. And that is entirely dependent on whether the EU acts in the interest of its member states, which is to have, cross-channel trade and not to have additional friction with what is their biggest export market, or whether they're still stuck in trying to teach us a lesson, whether they're still affronted rather than self-interested, whether they would rather see all sides suffer than watch a post-EU Britain succeed. And we'll find out in the next few weeks.
But I think there's a third thing as well, though. I think that they've lost with that position, and again, that's why I'm, obsessed with, is the public reaction to all this. I think, again, if these arguments had happened quickly after the result in 2016, I think that they might have got something much more favourable to the EU. You're in the UK and I'm in LA, so I'm only saying this from a distance. It seems to me that the EU has lost a lot of support from Remainers, who not hardcore Remainers, but a lot. I sense now a lot more interviews with sort of vox pops where people are just like, oh, just get on with it, get us out, no deal if necessary. Things that would have been unthinkable 4 years ago. A bunch of people that voted Remain are now expressing that actually the sky didn't fall in. They've. The EU, it seems to me, by taking so long to make these agreements, have made it possible for people to actually realise that it's not so urgent, or it's not as catastrophic as it's been described to them. And
yes, look, we know that, right? Because the predictions of economic calamity were written down during the referendum, so we can measure them against what happened. And we were told that there would be, another 2 million unemployed, that there'd be a massive decline in growth, that there'd be a collapse in pensions, that house prices would go through the floor. There's a bunch of measurable criteria, and none of it happened. Britain actually grew faster than the Eurozone coming out of the vote. Now, obviously, all of that has been superseded by the current economic calamity that we're in. And other than proving the point as to who was right, it's really now kind of totally irrelevant, because if you take the most optimistic projections of the keenest levers versus the most pessimistic projections of the most alarmist Remainers, in terms of how much we would grow or shrink as an economy, it's trivial compared to what has now happened as a result of the lockdowns. And that's true on both sides of the channel. I note in passing that a number of people who were almost hysterical about the supposed costs of Brexit have been cheerleading a very tough lockdown, despite the fact that it would have far worse economic consequences. Now, fair enough if they, if they think that was if they were that worried about the disease, but plainly the economic consequences of Brexit that they pretended to be so worried about were not uppermost in their mind. They must have actually had other motives, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, no, completely.
But even so, we're now in this situation where all of that, if you like, has been blown away, and I think that's had an asymmetric impact on the talks, in the sense that if there is going to be no deal, from Britain's point of view, it's much better to have that now, at the low point of the V, because coming out of the COVID recession, we're going to be doing a lot of things differently. We're going to be resourcing our supplies from different places. There's going to be permanent changes in how we work. Town and city centres are not the same. There's been a shift to online resale. There's a lot more of what you and I are doing now, which weirdly makes the case for looking further afield geographically, right? For looking at trade where we have cultural ties rather than accident of geography. Because if you're not able to travel and do a pitch in person, you might as well do it by video link with Australia as with France.
Yeah.
But all of that means that now is if we're going to risk no deal, now is the time to do it, right? The thing that was the single biggest concern for us all the way through about no deal, which was a deliberate go slow at the French Channel ports that was going to lead to tailbacks all the way through Kent. Frankly, given the collapse in trade volumes, that's the least of our worries. That's not in our top 10 worries anymore, right? We'd love to have tailbacks as a result of a pickup in international trade would be a huge improvement on the COVID recession that we're in at the moment, right? So now is the time, if we're going to have a major restructuring anyway, to do it with no deal. COVID, in other words, has lowered the cost of no deal from a UK point of view, whereas it has not had that impact on the other side of the Channel. From Britain's point of view, no deal, okay, there's more friction with our EU trading partners, and it's sad because it means that we don't have the same close alliance with them, but there are lots and lots of upsides in the sense that we can then do regulations and trade differently from day one. Whereas from the EU point of view, there's the downside of the extra trade friction, but nothing else changes at all. There is no upside, even in theory. And that ultimately is, if there is going to be a deal, that will be why. It will be because the 27 governments, looking at the economic mess caused by COVID, think, do we really need the additional headache of a no-deal Brexit just in order to teach someone a lesson about something? Is that really what's in the interest of my people? Well, we'll see which way that one goes.
And as I've said, my rambling reiteration that the British negotiators don't have their hand being forced by a groundswell insisting on some kind of deal. What's the deal? What's the deal? Was the only kind of that was the only message for a while last year before the 2019 election, and like nobody's. There isn't the same chorus anyway demanding some kind of deal as there was, and so that
right. Right, because it's all been blown out of the water by something bigger.
Exactly.
And God knows, I wish that had not happened. Right, I'd much rather not have had any of this ghastly situation and these closures, which are ruinous for young people and will take decades to recover from. But it does mean that the previous arguments about the economic impact of Brexit have suddenly been overtaken.
So what's next for you then? Now, I mean, this giant's been slain. You've won. I mean, you, after the actual deal is done and you can put this entire chapter to bed, what do you do next?
Yeah, no more politics. I'm a newspaper columnist. I write for the Sunday Telegraph on this side of the Atlantic. I write for the Washington Examiner on your side and for various other publications. And for as long as there are still dead tree papers, I'll carry on doing that. But I always wanted to have a go at teaching. For years and years while I was an MEP, I thought what I'd really like to do is to teach in universities. And again, that sector too has taken a knock, as virtually everyone has as a result of this. But I'm now doing some teaching in universities here in the UK and doing various visiting lectureships and visiting professorships around the world, some in South America, which, as you were kind enough to recall at the beginning, was where I was born. And indeed, touch wood, I should be in your part of the world in January. I'm hoping to be doing some lecturing both at UCLA and at the two San Diego institutions. So, but of course, all of that will depend on whether California has opened sufficiently by then to allow people to come and do it, and whether the campuses are open. We just have to wait and see.
Just one quick final question. Did Christine Amanpour ever retract the comments that she'd made, that she'd attributed to you about immigration? Was that ever resolved, that squabble?
Not to my knowledge. I mean, the thing about, not just Christine, but a lot of journalists is that I think the referendum flicked a switch in that they didn't feel they had to pretend to be impartial, a little bit similar to the Black Lives Movement more recently. There are occasionally these moments come along when the broadcasters, of course, broadcasters are always biased, like you're biased, I'm biased, all human beings have their prejudices. But usually broadcasters try and operate according to a kind of code, at least in their own minds, where they're trying to give all sides a fair hearing. And Brexit was one of those moments when, in the aftermath, they didn't even bother doing that. It was to them so clear that this was a bad thing that they felt that saying so was objective, and saying so angrily was justified. And I don't think that attitude made anyone think differently about Brexit. But I think it has made a few people think differently about the broadcast media.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true. I think, and that's a great note to let you have your life back and end this 40-minute torture for you. So I appreciate your time today.
Far from being a torture. You're very lucky to be there in the good weather and permanent spring of Southern California. It's nice to catch up with you.
Bless you. Yeah, it is permanent spring. That's a very good way of describing it. That's every single day you have a clear blue sky. I still can't. It's trippy for me still after 13 years. It's extraordinary.
Different from South Wales. This is why I was very, very keen when I was negotiating with the universities there, and they were saying, well, how much do you want to be paid, and then how much? And I was saying, look, guys, that. All of that is up for negotiation, but there's one thing where I'm absolutely digging in, which is that it has to be in bloody January. Oh, okay.
Common sense. That's perfect. Well, listen, thank you, Daniel Hannan. I'm so grateful for you talking to me today, and all the best. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.